The next book I want to introduce is this green-covered one. It looks like it's got something to do with grass. And it's called The Chinese Prose Poem, A Study of Lu Xun's Wild Grass, Yecao. First I'd like to introduce the author of this book, Nick Kaldis, who is sitting here. And he is an associate professor of Chinese Studies, director of graduate studies, and program coordinator for Chinese Studies in the Department of Asian and Asian American Studies at Binghamton University, SUNY Binghamton. He serves on the editorial boards of the Journal of Chinese Cinemas and Modern Chinese Literature and Culture, very active group, MCLC. And he is the literature book review editor for MCLC. I think you're from Ohio, aren't you?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm from Ohio too. He went to Ohio U and Ohio State, where I have a lot of close connections. So why did I want this book in my series? I mean, people could argue with a lot of the books that well, some of them are squarely in the series, but for others I have to make an argument for why I want them in the series. Well, all I would say is Lu Xun's my favorite modern Chinese author. And that's enough. But also, Lu Xun interacted a lot with people outside of China. And before there was even the concept of Sinophone, I think Lu Xun was acting like a Sinophone writer because he drew a lot of inspiration from things outside of China and inspired a lot of things outside of China from within. So I think Lu Xun deserves to be in my series, and I have no shameful feelings about that. So now I just turn it over to Nick to say why he wrote this book and what it accomplished.
Thank you very much, Victor. So Tony asked me in her email to me to mention quite a few things about Lu Xun for an audience that might not be familiar with his work. He's by most accounts, the most famous writer of the 20th century in China, and the book Yecao, Wild Grass, is considered perhaps his best or most difficult work. It's been a very daunting field to enter because he's also among the most written about people in Chinese scholarly discourse. And he's part of a very important generation of writers from the early 20th century who were raised and educated in this classical Chinese literature, philosophy, history, all of the traditions, and he was one of the masters, the best students of that tradition. And his generation distinguished themselves by then rejecting that entire tradition and adopting a stance in the early teens and 1920s that has been called radical totalistic iconoclasm by Li Yusheng and others, or rejecting Chinese culture in toto. They felt that China, which was being threatened by aggressor imperialist nations, was at risk of, if the situation continued, of losing its not only territorial autonomy, but experiencing cultural, social, and linguistic extinction. And so they adopted, in response to this rejection of their tradition, and promoted literature as one of the key features to help them counter this threat to China. They felt that literature, especially fiction and poetry, drama, could help create a new Chinese citizen, create a new center for Chinese culture that would make it a viable culture in the 20th century among these other westernized, modernized nations that were aggressors and threats to China. And Lu Xun and others, they combined Western literary forms with traditional Chinese themes and topics, local language, well, in Lu Xun's case, not just local modern traditions, but traditional Chinese literature, modern Chinese literature, and to create, they're commonly perceived as the pioneers of modern Chinese literature. There's quite a bit of debate about this, when exactly we should date the inception of this, but Lu Xun is clearly at the forefront of this group who are cited as inaugurating modern Chinese fiction and poetry. And this description doesn't really do justice to the amount of experimentation in early 20th century Chinese literature. A sense of the individuated self that was very important to them, finding the self and extracting it from its locus in the Chinese tradition, the Chinese family, Chinese history and philosophy. Art for art's sake, aesthetics, which was also a new and hotly debated topic among them. And topical social issues were also dealt extensively with in their literature. And I think this is what makes Lu Xun so important for us today, is because now that China is a very prominent cultural phenomenon at universities, and we're celebrating at my school through our Confucius Institute everything traditional about Chinese culture, it's very important to remember that in the early 20th century, the dominant attitude towards traditional Chinese culture in China, among Chinese intellectuals, was rejection, critique. And it's something that, if we honor that now, we're honoring a Chinese tradition, not imposing a sort of Western critical view on this material. So that's one thing I wanted to note. His work is considered the most philosophical, engaging, psychological among the 20th century writers. And it stands up to repeated readings. It never fails to bring undergraduate and graduate students and scholars together in conversation, and seems to be inexhaustible, at least to the present moment, in the amount of discourse it can generate among people. It's very, very dense material, but very readable and engaging. It draws you in. So Wild Grass is his only collection of modern poetry, and there are 23 poems in it. They're prose poems, plus a foreword that he wrote when they were collected in a book that is also, in my opinion, a prose poem. So 24 prose poems. And it's considered a masterpiece by all standards. And it's very complex psychologically. It has some apparent references to historical conditions, but it's clearly not making a lot of clear associations with its historical moment. And when I first read it, I found it very opaque and had difficulty with it, but I was very much drawn to Wild Grass. It's clearly reflective of its historical moment, but in an ambiguous and kind of vague way. You can't really tie any of the poems clearly, as many scholars have tried to do, to certain historical circumstances. And it's even much more importantly a very deeply personal, even dauntingly private text. Lu Xun bears his soul in quite a few of the poems, it seems. He's really struggling with a kind of impasse between despair and rallying some sort of resistance to despair in these poems. And those of you who know Liu Li's work will know that he focuses on that despair as one of his key themes when he looks at Lu Xun's work. I kept reading Yetzal and grappled with the poems, translated most of them for myself, and I've come to realize that I'm drawn to poetry that is appears to have come out of a deeply conflicted psychological state. I feel that the act of interpreting this kind of deeply psychological and conflicted work is one of the few places I have in academia where I can engage my own psyche and my own imagination as I interpret. And it demands that you do that, but it's also something that we don't get a lot of encouragement to do in Chinese literary studies, which are dominated primarily by literary historical and larger theoretical issues at the moment. And close reading of individual Chinese literary texts is not that widely practiced anymore. And in Lu Xun's own words, who gave me confidence, he said, "Poetry cannot be recognized by readers relying on philosophy and intellect." And then another person I draw from the works of Julia Kristeva, a psychoanalyst, she talks about interpreting poetry that it keeps our inner selves alive, keeps us alert to experiences of physical survival on the part of those who engaged in the struggle, and on our part as well. And so for me, in other words, we get new perspectives on the conflicts that are central to our own psychology, our own background, our own selves. We gain really important new perspectives on these issues that are of our own when we struggle with someone else's efforts to look deeply at those own issues in his own life. And that's the real reward of looking at wild grass. I became convinced because of reasons like this in my engagement with this text that a single book was necessary, because there was no book on Yetzal in English. There's lots and lots written in Chinese. And I'm deeply grateful to Cambria for agreeing with me that a text on Yetzal was necessary, because quite a few other very well-known academic presses that Victor Pry works with told me they were very interested and liked the manuscript, but that no one publishes single author text anymore, and no one's interested in poetry interpretation anymore. Really, I was told that quite a few times. And each chapter of the book, I think, presents original perspectives on the context and the content of the poems in Wild Grass. You'll find extensive footnotes that engage all of the extant literature and help relate the Yetzal poems to other works of Lu Xun's that I think have resonances and references. I employ a psychoanalytically informed method that I describe as a kind of collaboration with the reader and the author in producing new knowledge. It's not just his or just mine. And I reevaluate quite a bit of the greater historical context about this important period in Lu Xun's life. That it keeps our inner selves alive, keeps us alert to experiences of physical survival on the part of those who engaged in the struggle, and on our part as well. And so for me, in other words, we get new perspectives on the conflicts that are central to our own psychology, our own background, our own selves. We gain really important new perspectives on these issues that are of our own when we struggle with someone else's efforts to look deeply at those own issues in his own life. And that's the real reward of looking at wild grass. I became convinced because of reasons like this in my engagement with this text that a single book was necessary, because there was no book on Yetzal in English. There's lots and lots written in Chinese. And I'm deeply grateful to Cambria for agreeing with me that a text on Yetzal was necessary, because quite a few other very well-known academic presses that Victor Pry works with told me they were very interested and liked the manuscript, but that no one publishes single author text anymore, and no one's interested in poetry interpretation anymore. Really, I was told that quite a few times. And each chapter of the book, I think, presents original perspectives on the context and the content of the poems in Wild Grass. You'll find extensive footnotes that engage all of the extant literature and help relate the Yetzal poems to other works of Lu Xun's that I think have resonances and references. I employ a psychoanalytically informed method that I describe as a kind of collaboration with the reader and the author in producing new knowledge. It's not just his or just mine. And I reevaluate quite a bit of the greater historical context about this important period in Lu Xun's life. And let's see, I should talk about the research, future research. My close readings of the poems are not clearly the only way into these poems, because poetry is not given to sort of monolithic interpretations. But I hope that I've sort of cleared the way with this first English language study for other scholars. They don't have to do all the footnoting and the documenting of the literary history and other things, and can go right into the poems and further the dialogue and understanding of the importance of this particular work of art. And I'm still working on several of these poems in essays I'm planning for the future. So I continue to write on this material, and I don't think I'm done with it. Thank you.